Well, of course, let's stay on the U.S. economy. And as we've said, the big news is out of the White House, where President Donald Trump has finally unveiled his big program to pump some $1.5 trillion in public and private funds to making America's infrastructure great again. Trump is looking for bipartisan support of the plan, and only about $200 billion of that is slated to be direct federal funding, but even that may be too much for some of his Republican allies. Well, Democrats are likely to balk at his intention to restrain environmental overview of the projects. Here's some of what President Trump had to say on the plan.
We're going to make our infrastructure modernized, and we're really way behind schedule. We're way behind other countries. We always led the way for many, many years. Then, a number of decades ago, it slowed down, and over the last 8 years and 15 years, to be honest, it's come to a halt. This morning, I submitted legislative principles to Congress that will spur the biggest and boldest infrastructure investment in American history.
Well, for more, joining us from New York is Aaron Wren, a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research. He's specializing in urban issues. But first, let's go to our reporter in the studio, Asher Westropp-Evans. Asher, just break it down a little on what the cost of this project, where the money is coming, and where's it going.
Well, exactly right, Kalev. So, as you said, there's about $200 billion coming in federal funding. But if we take a look now closer at where that funding is being spent, you see a very interesting pattern forming. So, under the current proposal, $100 billion will be put towards direct grants for local governments in order to trigger investment. Additional $50 billion will be put towards rural areas, projects specifically in rural areas. $20 billion put towards large projects that can, and I quote directly from the project plan, lift the American spirit.
A little bit vague.
Yes, this stage, and $30 billion for miscellaneous existing infrastructure, a notably small amount for sort of renovations of existing infrastructure as opposed to innovative projects, which Trump looks to spearhead.
Well, I want to go to Aaron Wren in New York. Aaron, first of all, do those numbers add up? Are they being well spent, that $200 billion? And is it realistic to believe that the rest of that $1.5 trillion is going to be coming both from private sources and from states and regional governments?
Well, that's the bet that President Trump is making. He's taking a page out of his real estate development handbook, where he's looking to put in some of the federal government's money and try to leverage a whole lot of other people's money to get a lot of things built. The 20% potential match from this $100 billion pool is really designed to get other people to bring new revenues to the table, and I think that's going to be a big question mark as to whether they will.
Aaron, officials have said that $200 billion of federal support would come from cuts to existing programs. What's your understanding of what programs are going to lose from this infrastructure plan?
Well, that's going to be the interesting thing. We've talked about some of the so-called Tiger grants and some of the other transportation programs, I believe, are in the mix. But I believe that's to be determined at this point and would be negotiated with Congress.
Now, Asher, beyond the figures, there are some other suggestions being made here with this plan that may prove controversial.
Exactly right, Clive. And we can take a look here and see that some of the key points that have been seen as points of controversy around the plan. Firstly, this grant competition system that we've sort of already touched on a little bit. This idea that we're going to see seed funding from the federal government in order to generate the additional revenue. This is likely mostly meant to be driven by taxes, fees, or tolls, and meant to limit federal spending to only 20% of all the infrastructure money that's going to be spent in total. Furthermore, there's going to be an allowance to get federal agencies to divest in their assets, possibly selling of Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport and Washington Dulles International Airport, amongst other assets, and a limit to environmental reviews, limiting to just a 21-month deadline.
Well, let me hit you with that, Aaron, because limiting environmental reviews, plenty of people, certainly Democrats, are not going to be fond of that. What is your take? Is that a legitimate proposal to make?
Everybody agrees that the environmental review process takes too long. Even President Obama took some steps to try to limit it. The average environmental impact statement took 2 years to complete in the 1970s. Now it's up to 8 or more years for major projects. It needs to be streamlined, but that will be something that the environmental groups are definitely going to push back on. And keep in mind, that affects things like transit projects not just highways, things that are important to environmentalists as well. So more efficient transit projects might be one way to get them on board.
Aaron, big picture, when you hear this plan, a lot of talk leading up to it now that the Trump administration has revealed it. Do you think that this is realistic? Is it practical?
The thing I find most interesting is that by trying to leverage 80% new funding from the states and localities in the private sector, I think this will have them have more skin in the game, which may encourage them to be more fiscally sharp and fiscally disciplined themselves. When the federal government was paying 80% of the cost, there's no incentive to spend the money well. There were a lot of boondoggle roads to nowhere built with federal funding. In this case, they're going to have to make a much tougher decisions, and I think ultimately that's a good thing.
But Aaron, let's be realistic here. There's going to be pushback from local governments, from states, and a lot of those states have Republican governors, popular Republican governors. Is the Trump administration really going to be pressuring those governors to make those kind of tough decisions you're talking about?
Well, of course they're going to push back on it. They're going to want free money. They're going to want somebody else's money. I think the skin in the game principle that there needs to be money coming from both the federal and the state side is important. This is an attempt to essentially rewrite the way that federal government and state governments interact in infrastructure spending. Of course, it's going to be controversial. It may not succeed politically, either in tussles with the governors or with the Democrats who don't want to hand him a victory. But I think it's a very interesting approach.
And Asher, speeches are made, headlines are written, but it's going to take a while to see really how this pans out, how states react if this project actually works.
Absolutely. I mean, this has a number of steep roadblocks to get through in Congress before it has any chance of getting off the ground. There's fiscally conservative Republicans already speaking out against this additional spending. There's Democrats saying that this is simply not enough funding. You know, these vast divides are going to be hard to bridge, and it's going to be
divides in Washington.
Divides in Washington.
Hard to bridge, building bridges.
Exactly.
So far, President Trump building bridges hasn't been a specialty.
Exactly.
We'll see if it happens.
But maybe $1.5 trillion on paper can make it happen. Asher, Westropp-Evans, Aaron Wren in New York. Great to have you with us.